Welcome back to OpenLine. You know, this is one of those topics that touches everybody in a unique way, whether you are, have a child in the education system, or you know of a child in the education system, or you were at one time. There are a lot of aspects that are up for debate on Capitol Hill, lots of bills to get through. And so we have tonight with us Beth Brown with the Tennessee Education Association. Beth, once again, thanks so much for being with us tonight. Before the break, we were talking more about the funding rewrite for how Tennessee funds public education schools. I'm curious, it's gone through a couple committees over the last couple days, but this, as you've alluded to, there's a lot of moving parts to this piece of legislation. Do you feel like you still have the ability to imprint some of the concerns of educators in this bill, or do you feel like it's kind of moving through as introduced?
Well, what's interesting about this bill, Chris, is while the commissioner and representatives from the Department of Education have made budget presentations and presented information about the bill to various committees, it's not actually been moved and heard in any of the committees yet. It seems every committee has pushed it to next week. And I think that is because everyone recognizes that we have to make sure that we get this right. Our current funding formula, the BEP or Basic Education Program, was passed in 1992. Chris, I was in elementary school in 1992 when this was passed. I mean, this has been a long time ago. And so if we're only going to revise our funding formula for our education system once every 30 years or once a generation, we have to make sure that we get it right. And there are, in addition to kind of presenting the levels of the funding formula, there are other things that are in the bill and mechanisms that are causing some legislators some pause. For example, how we determine what is the ability or what's the fiscal capacity of local districts to contribute dollars to the funding of the students. You know, what's their tax base? There's a pretty significant shift proposed that honestly creates some real winners and some real losers with the proposed new formula. And it is incumbent upon our legislators, is absolutely imperative that every legislator, when he or she votes for this on this particular piece of legislation, they have to make sure that every district in their respective legislative district, every school district is going to come out ahead and to the good. We can't be passing legislation that's going to harm local school districts. And so there's an expression that talks about go slow to go fast. I know that our governor and our commissioner have publicly stated that they want Tennessee to be the fastest improving state in the nation for educational outcomes. If that's their desire, then let's slow this process down, make sure that we're getting it 100% right, so that we can move full steam ahead in improving education outcomes for our students.
Beth, we have a caller on the line, but before we get to George, hang with us. But I want to ask a quick follow-up question based off of what you said, talking about being deliberate in this process. Is it TEA's view, if you can't quite get it right this legislative session, are you open to pausing a year and trying to tackle it next year, or what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question, Chris, and an important one. You know, I think that there's a narrative that we've got to do it right now. There's this great sense of urgency. Yes, there's a sense of urgency. We want to do what's best for our students. But this piece of legislation, this new funding formula, is not going to go into effect until the 23-24 school year. And so we have an opportunity to take the additional dollars that the governor's suggesting for investment, put it through our current system for next year, and then spend the time next legislative session. Legislators could spend time this summer really diving into this, make sure that we get it exactly right for every student, because we have nearly 1 million public education students in the state of Tennessee who are counting on us to get it right.
Absolutely. George, I appreciate you being patient. He's joining us again with a question about, this time, student funding, as I understand. George, go ahead.
Yes, sir. My thing of it is here, because a lot of students, because, I graduated, back in 1984, that underprivileged, that, because most of the things that goes on nowadays is through the internet and that type stuff. Is there some way, some kind of bill or some kind of thing that can be like reach out to maybe the underprivileged kids that can't afford this, can, you know, be made to accessible for them to catch up, because, you know, cause a lot of people that don't have the, you know, online school, internet stuff, you know, is there some kind of way that they can just like, you know, have everybody, you know, not just search amount, but, you know, they can get access to that type service?
George, thanks for the call.
Yeah, George, that's a great point. And I will say, you know, I did serve on one of the 18 subcommittees that was part of the exploratory process in the discussions leading up to the proposed legislation that has the funding formula rewrite. And the committee on which I served was not the only committee that emphasized the need for additional technology funds. And my understanding is that the new base the base level funding, the $6,860 per student, incorporates increases for technology. So that has very much been a part of the conversation. We recognize that during the pandemic that we had a significant digital divide between some districts and some students in our state, and so that was part of the conversation. I do think that there are some infrastructure issues that can't be fixed with the education funding bill alone. It's going to take some other legislation and other supports. But as far as this particular bill, there was discussion around additional technology funding.
Absolutely, and I know that, you know, equity is always a concern of TEA, and we hope, obviously, lawmakers moving through all of this. I'm curious, just for people that maybe there are certainly members of our audience that like following the Tennessee legislature closely. What additional steps, how many more committees will this have to go through before it might get to a floor vote?
In the House, probably like 7. It has not gone through any. I mean, it's been calendared in the education committees, subcommittees. It has not started moving. So, you know, when you think about subcommittees, then full committees, not only in education, but because this is talking about funding, there's going to be a finance subcommittee, a finance full committee. That's just in the House. Probably it may have to go through government operations. There are a number of committees that this bill has to get through before it ever gets to the House floor. And it's the same with the Senate. The Senate may not have the subcommittees that the House does, but there are a number of committees in the Senate that this bill has to get through before it ever gets to the Senate floor for consideration.
And Beth, as you alluded when we started talking about the funding formula, that this has a wide-ranging impact and a lot of stakeholders. I wanted to just bring up, I actually did a story yesterday on the funding rewrite and talked to the Tennessee Disability Coalition, and they mentioned they had some concerns of how students with disabilities, the weights put on those. I think a lot of our viewers probably assumed, especially given that those students get additional weights and funding based off that, but they were concerned with some of the writing and the details that may lead to schools potentially over-identifying students or putting them in more inclusion classes versus general classes if they don't necessarily need it when it comes to the funding. That's just kind of one example, but it seems like there are lots of different groups involved that want to make sure that their slice of the pie is done in the correct way.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually read that story, and I think it's an interesting and it's a valid concern. I'm certainly not saying that there are districts that would intentionally do that. Is the potential there? Yes. So I think that that's an important conversation, and I'm so glad that the Tennessee Disability Coalition is advocating on behalf of our students with disabilities.
Absolutely. We have lots more that we can discuss, but we do have to fit in another commercial break. Stay with us.